Okay.
Like I've said, each week is really a standalone class. Of course, some ideas and concepts are repeated and we rehash them, but of course, each one can be understood for itself, and it's an exciting journey each time that we do that. So tonight's class, as we do each week, is picking one character. Try to pick it from that week's portion or approximately in that area of the Bible. So this week, the portion is called Emor. And most of it is actually not about any narrative story, as we would call it. It's about laws for priests, laws about the holidays, very detailed laws about all the different holidays. But right at the end, in the seventh reading, there's just a couple of verses with a cryptic story, a narrative over there about somebody who's called the cursor, or the one who's blasphemies God's name, which is a terrible, terrible thing. It's a great desecration of God's holy name. And this is a tiny little piece, but it's a famous piece because it has its own name, known as the one who blasphemies God, the one who curses God. And that's what we'll call them, the Megadef in Hebrew. Now, why is it such an interesting part? Because, as I said, it comes right at the end of a very busy portion, and it's easily overlooked. And if you read the verses as they are, it's actually somewhat cryptic, because the Bible is always written in a short, but this one is particularly true. And I'm going to share my screen with you in just a minute, and I want you to see how little information we're actually given, and at the same time, how we can unpack it in a real way. So here we are. I'm going to share the screen with you. I know we don't always pull up the reading, but this one is important because you'll appreciate the cryptic nature of the reading and then how we can really learn about this individual who we are focused on. So we are, okay. All right, so you should now see on your screen a, oops, there we go. You should see right over there by verse 10. And I'm going to read it. Very cryptic. It says, "Now the son of an Israelite woman, and he was the son of an Egyptian man, went out among the children of Israel. And they quarreled in the camp, the son of the Israelite woman and an Israelite man. And the son of the Israelite woman pronounced the divine name and cursed. So they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shlomit, the daughter of Dibri, the tribe of Dan. 12. They placed him in the guardhouse until his sentence would be specified to them by the word of the Lord." And then in the next three verses tell us that he was sentenced to capital punishment and he was put to death. That's really all the details that we have, and I'll just scroll down till the end. That concludes the portion. So a very small and somewhat cryptic way of writing the Israelite woman, the son, who is this, what is going on? So let's take a step back and really unpack this man's life. And we don't even have his name. The Torah does not give him a name. We just call him the cursor. As I said, he's known as the cursor in Talmud, and that is the story of him. So let's take a journey back to Egypt, which was not that long ago from when this happened, by the way. This story happened shortly after the Exodus. And in Egypt, many years before the Exodus, Moses was a prince. He grew up in the palace of King Pharaoh because he had been saved by Pharaoh's daughter. This gave him access to come in and out of the palace and watch the suffering of his fellow brethren, the Jewish men and women and children who were all being beaten miserably by Pharaoh and his taskmasters. One day, the verse tells us, Moses is walking out and he sees an Egyptian man beating a Jew almost to death. And Moses utters the holy name of God, known as the Shem HaMeforash, God's holy name, and with the power of that name, the Egyptian man is killed and he buries him in the sand. Later on, this man who was saved, those two Jews who were quarreling and who Moses had saved his life, actually went and snitched on Pharaoh and snitched on him to Pharaoh and went ahead and said, you know what, Pharaoh, there is a man who actually murdered one of your soldiers. And he is Moses, and Moses was sentenced to death, but God saves Moses. Why do we start with this story? Because it's very important to know what was going on in that little episode. Who was this taskmaster beating to death? Who was it? And we're told that it wasn't just a typical story of a vengeful, hateful, spite-driven taskmaster who was able to get his own ego pumped by beating another Jew. No, there was something else going on. You see, this man who was being beaten to death by an Egyptian taskmaster actually had come across a terrible, terrible crime that had taken place. This Egyptian taskmaster wanted to have intimate relations with this Jewish woman. He knew that as long as the Jewish man is in the home, he's not going to be able to do that. And so he has this terrible plot, and he wakes up this Jewish man in the middle of the night and tells him he has to go work, go do your quota, go build a wall, go do some type of construction, and he sends him out of the house. The woman, his wife, was unassuming. She was fast asleep in bed, and he comes and he rapes her. And that act of being together came to a pregnancy. And that pregnancy was this child who later becomes the curse. So there's a complex history behind this man who suddenly starts cursing God. He has a very, very difficult past. But let's put him on hold for just a minute. The next day, when the Jewish man, the husband, realizes the atrocity that had taken place, the Egyptian taskmaster recognized that his whole plan was going to be uncovered. So what does he do? He uses his position of power, his position of influence, and he beats him, and he wants to kill him because the husband will be dead and then no one will know. And that's when Moses steps in. And Moses comes along and saves this man from death and kills this wicked Egyptian who had just done a terrible, terrible, terrible thing to this unassuming, unsuspecting Jewish woman. That is the story that we're told. Now, as you can understand, this young boy grows up in a very difficult situation because his mother's Jewish, but his father is actually a wicked Egyptian taskmaster who's dead. And he knows it, and the mother knows it. And they kind of try to keep it a secret because they don't want it to become publicized that this man is from a difficult and not a very good background. And so he lives with his mother. He continues going along the desert, Egypt, Exodus, all of that. He goes along with his mother, and everything is fine. But then comes this individual, and something triggers him. Something gets him really, really upset. And what does he do? He says, you know what? I am so angry that I'm going to cry out and curse God. What is it? What triggered him to do that? The verse doesn't say. Remember, I read it. It just says this Israelite man and the son of an Israelite woman were fighting, and he cursed. What's going on? And so the rabbis offer a number of different interpretations of what exactly this man was so upset about. What caused him to become so desperate that he would do such an unimaginable thing inside the camp of the Jewish people for everyone to hear publicly without embarrassment, cursing God, throwing the whole camp in confusion. Nobody knew what to do with such a person because it was such an unfathomable atrocity towards God. And so one of the explanations brought is that he went on a path of mockery. You see, the law that is taught right before this story is introduced in the Torah is a law all about the showbread. And let me give some background. In the tabernacle, the Mishkan, there were many, many different vessels. The ark is very famous. There's the wash basin, the candelabra, the menorah, of course. One of those vessels was called the shulchan, the table, the showbread, which had a display of 12 loaves of bread each week, called the showbread, in Hebrew, lechem hapanim. And what was the purpose of this? Well, we're told that at the end of each week, the priests would come along and they would have a chance to take a piece of this bread as part of their payment for serving in the temple, right? They couldn't own land. They were not allowed to have any crops for agriculture. So how did they live? How did they survive? Through the priestly gifts. One of them was the showbread. Whoever worked in the temple, the tabernacle that week was able to take was able to take a piece of this bread home for their family to enjoy and have some type of nourishment. But what was unique about this showbread? It wasn't like a bakery. Each morning, new loaves were put on and the old loaves would go off. No, there was a unique process. There was a special order that this bread had to follow. And that was, it was put in on Shabbat and it stayed a whole week. And then only after the following Shabbat were they able to take it off and put the new bread in. So the bread was only eaten 8-9 days old. It wasn't fresh out of the oven. But in fact, it was a real miracle. It was a miracle and a testament to God's greatness that despite a normal, natural process of bread spoiling or becoming stale, definitely not enjoyable after 9 days of sitting out in the open, it was still tasty, it was still fresh, there was no worms, there was no mold growing up. And there's a deeper message there, that God is showing us that our bond with him will always be fresh. And that is what the showbread represented on a deeper level. So this law was taught to the Jewish people so that they could know. As I said, this whole incident takes place right after the Mishkan, the tabernacle, has been dedicated and has started the work. So this was one of the areas of service to God. This man, this cursor, and again, this is according to one opinion, there's multiple explanations here. But this individual, what happens? He goes and he says, this is ridiculous. This is so silly. Who's ever heard of such a thing? Which king wants stale old bread? And he starts making a mockery out of it. And he starts laughing and scoffing. Eventually, one individual was upset. And he stood up for God's honor and says, how dare you? And they're fighting back and forth. And the fight got hotter and hotter until he was so upset that he cursed God. That's one explanation, that he was using Judaism and practice and divine service as a tool to laugh, to scoff, and to poke fun. What's the other explanation? The other explanation is a little bit more complicated. As we know today, from birth, and we learned about the idea of conversion last week, so we're going to put conversion aside. But from birth, a Jew becomes Jewish based on the maternal line, and their tribal factor is from the paternal line. And so what happens is that you have a man whose mother is Jewish, but his father is an Egyptian man, no longer around, but his father's an Egyptian. Now, it's true, he was born and became a part of the people before there was a nation. But the fact is, the way the Jewish camp was set up was in a way of the tribes. Each tribe had a very specific placement where they should be. The tabernacle was in the middle, the center, the focus, and all around the tribes spread out. And it was a very specific order. And each person had to stay within the boundaries of their tribe. And where did they get their tribe? From their father. So this man turns to the tribe of his mother, which was the tribe of Dan, and he says, I want to belong here because my mother is from Dan. And they tell him, sorry, there's no space for you. You're not in our books, in our ledgers. You don't fit. You can't stay here. You know where you could stay? You could stay outside the camp with the mixed multitudes. All those people who All those stragglers who decided to join the Jewish people. That's where you belong. Sorry, no space for you here. And he was hurt by that. So they go to court. They go to Moses. And Moses rules in accordance with this man from the tribe of Dan who says, we don't have space for you. This is not where you belong. And he gets upset about that. And he's very hurt and angered more and very, very embarrassed, perhaps. And so he goes out and curses God. That is the story as we have. But I really want to take a look at this from a very different perspective. And I think there's multiple angles, and they're all right. And they're all lessons, and they're all practical in our day-to-day life. But I want to approach it from a very different place. If we had this man sitting in front of us on a therapist's couch, and there he is, he calls in, he says, I've got problems, I need help. And I'm the therapist, and I'm hearing him tell my story. I'm taking notes mentally with pen and paper, however I do it. What am I hearing as he starts telling me? Well, for one, he certainly has had a troubled upbringing. His biological father is not around. Not only that, his biological father is a hater, is someone who beat Jews. In fact, he wanted to beat his mother's true husband. And just to put that into perspective, just because I think it's very important that we do that, imagine, God, and sadly, this happened, where Jewish women were disgraced. The Holocaust, all wars. It's a terrible atrocity that takes place. And imagine a young Jewish man wakes up to find out that his father is actually an enemy, a hater, an anti-Semite. Horrible. Can't be very good. So he's troubled. You see that right away. He has issues. Maybe he has never found a place of connection. He hasn't found a place of acceptance. He doesn't even have a tribe, but his mother has a tribe. It's not like he's just another one of those multitudes who came randomly or born Egyptian. He doesn't feel that way. He identifies with his mother, who he spent time with, who he left Egypt with. And so when he wants to let out that anger, it kind of logically makes sense in a certain way that he will direct that at the very religion that seems to be oppressing him. Now, that doesn't justify. Unfortunately, people use outlets, oftentimes religion, as their excuse, as their blanket for their true, deeper anxiety, trauma, depression needs as well. And so here he is. He's not allowed to live here, he was told. Or he hears about this showbread, and that's it, he's had enough. And so he goes laughing and mocking and scoffing. Now, of course, that's wrong. Of course, that's not the way we channel our pain and our troublesome history if we have it. But that's what he does. He's a young man. And he cries out for help in a very strange way. And this other person, instead of hearing the cry and maybe embracing him and maybe showing him the beauty of his religion and the joy of it and the pleasure one can derive from serving God and the soaring sense of fulfillment that a soul feels when connecting to God. Instead, this man gets up and publicly grapples with him. He attacks him. He challenges him. And that only escalates the situation. So for a young man who's troubled, being cornered, being pushed, being attacked like that is not the solution. And so eventually it pushes him over the edge, so to speak, and he curses out to God. And he is every bit responsible for his actions. No one can say, my circumstances forced me to act this way. No, he is responsible and he paid for it. He paid for it with his life. But yet, I want to come from a different place. I want to say, as a society, what happened to us and our responsibility to someone who is troubled? Now, to make matters worse, think about it. He goes to court and Moses is the judge. Now Moses knows that he's the one who actually killed the father of this boy because he had to, and it's to save the life of another. But that's the fact. And so Moses is himself cautious. And that's why you'll read the verses, Moses puts it on delay. He says, I got to wait and find out. He didn't want there to be an appearance of spite, bias, or even fear that this boy's going to retaliate against him. So Moses understood the severity of the situation, but it didn't help in that sense. This other man triggered him, goaded him, attacked him, pushed him, and so it brought him over the edge. Again, he's fully responsible for his action. But we, as we look at the story, should also look at the angle from a perspective, from a prism that says, where do we play a role? When we see someone suffering, when we see a troubled youth, do we attack them? Do we berate them, lecture them, shame them, guilt them? Or do we try to embrace them and try to show them a better way of living? Try to guide them into a path that says you can make better decisions in your life. And this man was a case of shame, of embarrassment for his family and for his whole tribe. We're told a person has a heavy responsibility on their shoulders. When we act, it's not just me, myself. It's I represent something. I represent my family, my community, my people. And that is why the verse, only after telling us the whole story, singles out the name of the mother. Yes, this is an embarrassment to her. And then it singles out the name of the tribe, an embarrassment. And by the way, the Torah does it for the positive as well. When a person of status, when a great person is from a certain tribe, the Torah, God, makes sure to emphasize that. It goes both ways. But here he is a cause of embarrassment to the whole tribe. Because in a certain sense, where were they helping this young man who had a very troubled past, but he needed help? And I don't know his diagnosis. That's not the point of my conversation here. It's not the point of this perspective that I want to share. But I do want to open up our eyes to this collective responsibility that we have that says, you know what? What is our reaction to those who are troubled? For one, I can say it's not mine. I'll leave it alone. Two, it's his issue. It's her issue. She got herself into this mess. He is doing this. He's making bad choices. Let him get out of it. We can't let that happen. We look around and we see people suffering and struggling. Their decisions are on them. Person drinks, substance abuse. Yes, it's a terrible calamity. It's their decisions. But what is our responsibility? We can't look idly and say, you know what? That's not on me. I can't do anything about it. We have to try in whatever way we can. And we certainly can shun them. We can't push them away, because if we push them away, then there's no chance that they come back. Now, that doesn't mean we supply them in any unhealthy manner. Doesn't mean we give in to their needs of negativity, of abuse for their own body. But yet, at the same time, we can show them that there is an opening. There is an outstretched hand. We can care for you. We worry about you. And we are willing and happy to help you in any way that we can. Because ultimately, you are a part of something bigger. And if you are part of this community, the Jewish people, then your troubled upbringing in a certain way reflects on us as a society that we let it pass. There's a great story of Mayor LaGuardia in New York back in the day. It says he was quite an active mayor. And from time to time, he would walk to the local courthouses just to see what was going on. Because by going in and seeing the different petty crimes, who was on the bench, that gives him a feeling of the atmosphere and the temperature in the city. Where's crime holding? Where are people at? So one evening, he walks into a local courthouse and he tells the judge that you can go for the evening. Thank you for your service to the state. To the city, I'm gonna take over from here. And he sits down and he looks at at the docket to see what's coming up. And there it is. There's a man, an elderly man, and an elderly woman. And this man has come to press charges against this woman. And there's this old woman. She's visibly sad, upset, and cold. And LaGuardia turns to the man and says, yes, what is your claim? Why are you here? He says, well, I actually own a little grocery store down the road. I have drinks, I have milk, some vegetables, I have bread. And this woman came in and she was shoplifting. I caught her putting a loaf of bread inside her bag, and I stopped her and told her she has to pay, and she ran off. So I called the police and they caught up to her, and here she is. And I want my, whatever it was at the time, 20 cents for the loaf of bread. And LaGuardia is thinking and says, okay. Turns to the woman and says, you heard the claim, you heard the charge. What have you to say for yourself? What's your defense? And she breaks down crying and she says, yeah, it's true. It's true. That's true. I did steal it. I'm guilty. But I have 3 young grandchildren at home living with me, and they haven't eaten for days. And I just couldn't put them to bed for another night without food, without a morsel of something to help them. Poor kids. And so I was desperate. And yes, I stole a loaf of bread. If I had the money, I would have paid. I'm not trying to be a criminal. I would have paid gladly. I just didn't have the money. And the face of my young grandchildren going to sleep again, hungry and starved, I couldn't bear. And she cried. So LaGuardia takes a moment of thought. He looks at the court. Crowd had gathered. People heard that the mayor's around. And he says as follows. He says, you are guilty of shoplifting, of theft, and you owe this man not just the 20 cents, but you actually owe him an additional $5 fine. And she cries and cries. She doesn't have the money. But, he says, before anyone can leave, he says, I am fining each one of you in this courtroom 20 cents. Because how can we live in a society where a grandmother is desperate enough that she has to steal bread to feed her hungry grandchildren? And so he gathers the 20 cents and he gives the woman $15 in total, and she pays her dues for the bread, and she gets enough money for bread for many, many days to come. And I think that those words are very, very powerful. Guilty she was. But how can we sit idly by in a society that allows such a thing to take place? We have to think bigger and better than that. And this is really what the story of the cursor brings to light. Again, guilty he was. He paid for it. He did not deal with his challenges properly. And there's a whole class we can have just on him. But I want to come to it from a different perspective. What can each one of us do when we see someone who's troubled? Troubled in any way. Someone who's struggling and they're making bad choices. Or they are about to make a bad choice. Or they need guidance to avoid making decisions that have severe repercussions. Where do each one of us stand in that situation? And the truth is, this is a lot of the exposure that I have had over the past years. And I push myself more and more to do it, even though it might sound strange. Chabad is a Jewish organization. How are we getting involved in the social needs of the community? But the truth is, how can we, as a community, as a Jewish organization here in town, be able to say, I'm just closing my eyes to an issue that plagues everyone, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, religion, and so on. And that's where I've been able to see these firsthand stories where people who are troubled are either pulled down that path or they're pulled up and they're helped and they're saved. And I just want to share with you in conclusion, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts and take on all this. I want to share with you about a colleague of mine. A colleague, meaning a fellow Chabad rabbi. He's much older than I am. And he found himself dealing with a very unique demographic of people. His name is Rabbi Benny Zippel, and he is Chabad representative on Salt Lake City, Utah. And of course, his initial move to Utah was to establish a beautiful Jewish community, get involved there, which he has. But he realized very, very quickly that there is something unique about Utah that gives him an opportunity to help people in a very different way. And that is that they have these boarding schools for really troubled youth. We're not talking about strict schools. We're talking about kids who have severe, severe behavioral challenges where the only solution for the parents is to send them away for 6 weeks, 6 months, 2 weeks to become fully immersed in a therapeutic environment where every moment of the day is giving them tools and ideas and the therapy that they need to become better people so that they can go back home and join society. Now, as you would imagine, many of these kids of all ages, 9, 10, 16, 17, many of these kids have a very bad relationship with their parents. Often troubled youth are berated and pushed aside. And we're not here to cast any judgment. It's a very difficult situation, especially when there's other siblings involved, and this one might be a bad influence or ruining the family dynamics. It's a very difficult thing. So these kids, these youth are very distrusting of authority, and that's part of their healing that they need to go through. The idea of trusting adults in their life, the idea of listening to instructions for their own safety and their own health. And Rabbi Zippel has started a program, not recently started, he started many years ago, a program where he was able to bring the light and joy of Judaism to these kids who are going through tremendous challenges. And he has built connections with many of the different schools there and the different camps or whatever they're called. And this has enabled him to interact with the most interesting people who have had terrible, terrible challenges, and many of them have come out better on the other side. And Rabbi Zippel takes his car and drives 100 miles across the state because that enables him to take a piece of matzah, a shofar, a tefillin, a menorah to these kids. And what it does for these children is to say, you're not an outcast. You're not forgotten. You're not shunned. We love you. We care about you. And he has so many stories of this one called up, my son is in this program. Can you do anything before Passover? My daughter is here. Can you help her before Hanukkah? And this is just a small part of his work. But what he did was he opened up the channels of connection, of love and care for these kids to say, society has not forgotten about you. Yes, you need to be in these programs and they're tough. And I'm not taking any of that away. I'm not here to bail you out. But you should know that we as a community, as a society, as a people, have not forgotten about you. We love you and we care about you dearly. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Oh, there we go.